Hello, hello, welcome, everyone.
Hello,
What a
can you
pleasure
hear
to
me
have
okay?
you here. I know you're not very patient, and I love that. We're gonna have a discussion, but there is a break, so everything is managed. And I'm just gonna give a little bit of an introduction. So welcome everyone again. It's my pleasure to see you all like this together after a few months of setting this all up. And this is a panel discussion on executing clinical projects and programs in a resource constrained environment. And I'm just going to say who we've got here. So I'll start with the ladies, if I may. We've got Katie from Y Summits. Kidding. We've got Tina. We've got Tina Karunaratne. And Tina is the head of global clinic operations from Orm Therapeutics. Welcome, Tina. We've got Vivian Tran here. Hi, Viv. Welcome. Can we hear it perfect? Yeah, can we hear
you?
Yes.
Perfect. We've got Viv here. Vivian Tranch is the Associate Director of Drug Safety and PV Operations, Allogene Therapeutics. Welcome. And two gentlemen right here, Stephen Smith. And Stephen is the Senior Director and Program Manager from Encoder Therapeutics. Hello, welcome.
Thank you, Katie.
And we've got Darshan Shah, who is actually the moderator of this entire panel discussion. He's the Senior Director in Launch Excellence Planning and Readiness from Insight. With all of that, please carry on. And I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I can hear you.
Oh, all right, great.
Okay.
Great, and it's a great honor and pleasure to moderate a panel of very distinguished people with lots of experiences on the topic that we are going to be talking about. We're good. It's a Friday afternoon, at least here on the East Coast, so we're going to spare the people with too many slides. I think, Katie, I did provide you just a slide to basically share some of the key points that we're going to talk about. So maybe if you want to flash that, that would be great. So that way it just acts as a little guide for our audience as well as our panelists. So what we'll do is, and Katie, thanks for introducing our guests. All of them work in very cutting edge technologies at their respective companies. Allergen. And then Tina is at Orm Therapeutics, and then of course Stephen at Encoded Therapeutics. So we'll start out with Tina on the point about, and again, to remind people of the topic. The topic is about executing clinical trial projects and programs in resource constrained environment. And why even resource constrained environment? Regardless of the size of the companies, uh, we always have resource issues, whether it's dollars or FTEs or both combined. And companies, and especially this is the time of the year or close to the this time when budgets are being decided and some programs are put on hold, some are proceeded ahead, and so on. So I thought it was a timely topic to have a discussion on this area. So what we'll do is start out with a question to Tina about, so what are the leading kind of the drivers for resource and budget planning when it comes to doing the resource and budget planning for the portfolios or clinical trial projects. So we'll kick off with what your thoughts are related to that and your experiences.
Awesome. Thank you, Darshan. Very timely topic. I'm actually currently working right on this in my company. Speaking of resource constraints, I am N of one in the company for clinical operations. And then we are one person in clinical development, the chief medical officer. So I'm going to share my thoughts in terms not just of this company, but in the past, how we've done things, especially coming from a small organization, but also medium organization. The number one thing to recognize is the human resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the key resources that we need to have in-house versus outsourcing? What would be our outsourcing model? First of all, is it a full service CRO? Is it kind of niche, boutique kind of vendors, or a hybrid of it, right? So in terms of internal resourcing, you want to understand what are some of the absolute resources that you want to have in-house. So for example, like our chief medical officer and my role in the organization. So beyond that leadership role, we are at the moment hiring a clinical operations lead who can actually manage all of the vendors, right? There's got to be so much vendor oversight that you need to have somebody. So that person is important. So regardless of the resource constraint, we need to have this clinical operations lead. But beyond that, all of your expertise you can get externally. You can either get them through individual contracts as consultants, or you can, as a one-stop shop, get it from your CRO. So that's kind of your human resources. Then you move on to your kind of non-human resources, your capital equipment, if you will, right? And the question that comes to bear is to lease or not to lease. And do you want to go that route, or do you want to buy it outright? How can you write it off your budget if it's capital equipment? The wear and tear, all of that through the years. Can you write it off, or are you better suited for actually leasing equipment? In one company that I worked at in ophthalmology, we actually decided to lease some of the infusion pumps and other delivery equipment that we needed, as opposed to buying it outright. But that said, there were more expensive imaging equipment, such as OCTs and all of that, which we helped some of the sites to actually purchase, because it was an investment for us, because we knew we were going to work with the sites long term. And given the life of the machine, it felt it was a good investment. And so when you're thinking about, budgeting and from a resourcing perspective, I think, as I mentioned, these are some of your key drivers. You want to start thinking about your patient costs. That is, I think, number one. What is the per patient cost in your budget? Because alongside that, you got to think about, are you going to reimburse sites for standard of care, or are you going to have them take that on as part of your everyday treatment plan? So patient costs. Then you want to think about, of course, as I mentioned, your CRO costs, depending on the scope of work, and then your site costs in terms of what are the other costs that come into play. And lastly, as I mentioned about vendor oversight, you want to create that governance structure, so that you have that collaboration, that working relationship. And one way to make it happen is through a governance committee, where representation is from both sides, the vendor as well as the sponsor.
Right. No, thank you, Tina. Viv, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I like that Tina. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm not sure. I like that Tina mentioned that a lot of collaborations with your vendors and when you outsource, because a lot of companies nowadays, big and small, they outsource a lot. You work with CROs, and a lot of it is, how do you keep the communication going? How do you hold each other accountable? So I did like Tina brought up governance to make sure everyone can speak to it, can be accountable. It's something I'm trying to build in-house as well. And I relate to Tina, a team of N of one. That's pretty much what I am right now in PV Ops. So I found it really insightful. So thank you, Tina.
Great. I'll just add a sort of a different perspective. I think Tina laid it out beautifully, of the considerations and the options available. I come from, this is my second startup in gene therapy. And I think, as we know, in gene therapy, it's kind of the Wild West in drug development. It evolves very quickly. It's changing all the time. There is now, when I was with my first company, there was a very little runway when it came to regulatory approvals, or even the process for approvals. It's evolved a little bit over the last couple of years, but it's still pretty fluid, I think. So one of the considerations we have in a startup environment is, what disease are you working in? Is it something that is a broad indication, a broad disease, or is it a rare disease? And the two companies that I've worked for have been targeting rare diseases. And in those rare diseases, there may be very little expertise developed in drug development, or an understanding of really the patient population or the course of the disease over time. So one of the overarching principles, at least in the two companies I've been with, when it came to resourcing, was really a drive to build internal expertise. us within the teams, within the clinical teams, becoming the world leaders in engaging with KOLs and understanding the disease. So we wanted to keep that in-house versus outsourcing to a CRO, in which we were perhaps in a way giving them the opportunity to develop that expertise of that niche disease. We wanted that in-house. And so there were a lot of decisions made on building up the resources available internally. So one example that is often outsourced is biostats support. In other companies I've worked for, that's an example where we rely perhaps initially on a CRO to provide biostatistician. We wanted to build that expertise internally. And so we made the point of keeping that in-house. And we've been able to leverage a couple of these resources that we've built internally rather than outsourcing in other areas outside of clinical. So our biostatistician has been amazing in supporting even some of our non-clinical, preclinical analysis. So we've been able to leverage him to do that. So I would say, in consideration of whether you're going to build internal expertise or outsource externally, think about where you want to, what disease you're working in, and where you think you can leverage that resource in the future and for other departments outside of clinical.
So it looks like, Stephen, from your description, that there is a deliberate decision making with respect to that. There are certain skill sets or certain knowledge things that you want to retain inside the company because it is such a proprietary technology, and that you want to, even perhaps maybe at a certain level of cost, because obviously this is to have that skill set developed within the company is going to cost certain amount of resources, whether either people or money or etc. So is that a kind of a decision making that happens early on in the process, where that before you even embark further on into the development phase, that hey, look, we are biostats, we're going to do the in-house medical writing, we're going to do in-house, other aspects we're going to outsource. Just wondering about that thought process.
Yeah, I think everything starts the way Tina described it. You usually have your chief medical officer, and in my cases, I worked well with our chief medical officer, who has a vision that can be communicated to the CEO. And there's a dialogue there of how well the fundraising is going for a startup. Can you afford it? And a justification and a rationale provided for bringing that very expensive resource in-house. Part of that consideration is not just the one program that you may have built the company around, but what is coming up in your pipeline, and how quickly are those assets going to come into development, out of research, and how easily will you be able to leverage that internal expertise that you've kept in place and use them for not just a single program, not just a single department, but across programs and even supporting other departments.
Right. With respect to, given the sizes of the companies and relatively, the number of programs, what is kind of the structure of the governance, if there is anything? And maybe I know Tina spoke briefly about governance, setting up governance, especially internally, and also with the vendor management, so that way, hopefully, the both sides are properly aligned. But from Stephen, your perspective, and Viv, yours, how's the governance structure, kind of the setup with respect to the resources for the programs?
Viv, do you want to go first?
You can go first, Stephen.
Okay. We in a startup environment, it's for me, it's a very flat organization. We've not built out significant levels, and so when we talk about resourcing and we talk about making large investment decisions, oftentimes the C-suite folks are part of your core team. So part of when you have a single program, all eyes are on the program. Everybody knows the details. Everybody's in it. Everybody walks the walk and talks the talk about that single program every day. And so it's the decision making can be pretty streamlined because you've got all the major players in in the room. I think I've been in organizations where we've quickly brought in a second, third, or even fourth asset into development, and it creates a lot of complexity because now you are not doubling or tripling the size of your organization to accommodate these new assets. You're finding better ways of working and streamlining, and decision making has to be even clearer because oftentimes your final decision makers start to move away from your core teams and they become sort of an executive team or a leadership team or whatever. And that's where the buck stops when it comes to making final decisions about investment. So we're following a standard format of having an LT, and I've done this in a couple companies, and then program specific core teams that run the day to day.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Viv?
And then I can add to Stephen's experience that from smaller companies that I've been at, very startup environment, they do have a governance setup, but then it moves into more senior leadership. They're making the big decision. They try to understand what's the data they have, the resources, and they can make the decision. And it kind of trickles down from a bigger company that I've also been at. Their governance is more set up to understand, this project, how far along are we? What are the issues that we have? How are the resources looking? And then that trickles up to the senior leadership team. So I've seen it work both ways. And it's just how flexible you can be as a company, what works best for you. So to Stephen's comment that it moves from governance to you have your core senior leadership team, they make the big decision, and then it kind of disseminates downwards, and then you start building programs, pipelines around that. So hopefully that kind of adds to that.
Because of COVID, everybody's experienced the impact of that, and lately, or it's been for quite a number of months now, the whole thing about the Great Resignation that you keep hearing about. Given that within biotech, you guys are even way more specialized than perhaps some of the other, mid to large size companies. How does that impact? We are already talking about resource constraints, but when you are relying on such specialized knowledge base and technologies and skill sets required, how has COVID-19 kind of impacted resource needs in your respective situations?
I can kind of speak to that. So currently right now, I'm trying to build out the operations team for drug safety. And because of the situation, we have to really consider, can we do remote working? Can it be full-time? Because then candidates start asking, well, I work on the East Coast, can I do full-time remote? And we have to be very flexible to build our resources out. You cannot rely on the CROs to do everything for you. Like Stephen said, you want to build in-house the expertise, you want to start building up internally versus always expanding outward. So that's something we're looking to, and it has been a challenge looking for the ideal candidate for what we're doing, what our expectations are. So for me, it has been a challenge.
Tina?
Yeah. So I think we heard the earlier speaker talk about agility, right? It's all about that, flexibility and agility. And we sure had ourselves all tested during the pandemic. So I fully agree with what Vivi said in terms of, we've got to kind of go out of our comfort zone and, be able to trust the employees and say, okay, you're going to be working, full time because you are a good, you have the expertise that we're looking for. You are in the West Coast, we are located in the East Coast. That's fine. That kind of hiring decisions. And also, I think even whether it's resource constraint or even for that matter, running your projects without damaging your timelines. For me, I found myself, I was running a phase 3 trial at that time. And it's like, you got to be, quick thinking on your feet, and you got to think outside the box. Yes, you have to think inside the box for regulatory constraints and checks and balances, but thinking outside the box. I remember, telling the CRO, we're not going to do any qualification visits, even by phone. We're not doing it because the clinical environment was so drained from everything that was happening. The last thing I wanted them to do is have another phone call for another 2 hours just to talk about, feasibility questions. And I was like, no, we will share the questionnaire. Let's hope they fill it out. But if there is interest and if we know either we're familiar with the site or through another sense we get the referral that the site is a good site, we're going to go for it. We've got to take that plunge and take on those challenges and give the benefit of the doubt to the site, because they are also wanting to treat patients out other than the COVID patients, right? And so
Right.
those trials had to go on even though there was a slowdown. So yeah, I think it's quick thinking, and you just got to go sometimes with your gut, hoping that and of course, as Stephen said, you have to have the alignment from your leadership. That's very important, because you can't just do it in a silo and say, oh yeah, by the way, I made this decision. It's got to, there's got to be that kumbaya moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. COVID's put us in a very interesting situation. Tina and Vivian have mentioned sort of finding the right person. I think this remote work has given us the opportunity to even consider folks that aren't geographically where your company is.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can, hire somebody. We're in the West Coast. We can hire somebody in the East Coast. As long as you feel that they fit with your corporate culture and the way you work. Whereas I think prior to COVID, it was always geographically limited. You wanted your folks to co-locate together in an office and work together. COVID has changed that. That being said, we have had a really challenging time finding that right person. It is really, in my opinion, I don't know how long this will last, and it's wonderful for us, but it's an employee market out there. There is a lot of demand for good people with good track records of being able to lead and deliver on projects, and finding that person at the right level is also hard. One of the challenges is, in a resource constrained company, not only are you financially resource constrained, you're also running your programs as fast as you can.
Right.
To try to, you're always thinking of that financial runway of how much money do we have. So we've got to get to these milestones, right? So that we can leverage and extend that runway with additional fundraising and things like that. But you can only do it when you hit these milestones. So not only are you resource constrained, but you're often under intense pressure to accelerate as much as you can. And finding the people that can work in that environment is tough. But also bringing them in at the right levels has been challenging too, because it's such an employee market out there. The demand for higher titles compared to the work that we're expecting of them. Salary packages obviously have to be competitive. And, a big consideration, I think, for folks joining a startup is equity. What is the potential for the company that I could generate equity? And so there's just a lot out there. So I hear both Vivian and Tina's frustration. It's the same with mine. It is so hard to find the right people at the right times for your programs. And, and we've been, because we couldn't do that very effectively in all areas, we have relied on a lot of consultants in addition to CRO support. So we'll maybe have a one-off consultant for a particular area. And so consultancy has been also an avenue for us to meet our needs.
So that's kind of at least one mitigation kind of a step, by using consultants. And there was kind of, as you were talking about that, especially pre-IPO kind of situations where you got certain amount of funds and there is a cash burn going on. There are milestones to be met. You have resource constraints because you don't have the right skill type of people available. How has this kind of impacted each of you individually in terms of upping your skill set level to just basically fill the gaps? And it's not just you alone, but obviously it'll impact the entire team member, the collective team members in your respective companies and the projects. But how has that impacted, say, well, look, I don't have the person that was supposed to be getting this thing done. I have this milestone to meet. And now it has impacted you in terms of delivering things, doing things that you probably pre-COVID weren't really planning on doing. Has that happened to you?
Yeah, it did actually. As I mentioned in the when I was in my past role, when I was conducting a phase 3 trial, Darshan. And so it took me a while. As Stephen said, it was really hard. Even at that time, when the pandemic had just started, to hire. And I think people were just probably just demotivated and just afraid to make any decision, right? So as I said, in terms of trying to do some quick thinking, my next resort was to hire a contractor, and a contractor that was way above what I wanted, in a clinical operations lead. So in order to give me that comfort level that, oh yeah, this person can definitely deliver, So what this meant was stretching the budget, going above in terms of what this contractor's rate would be, but assuring leadership that the milestones will be met, at least close to the dates that we had projected. And that definitely worked, because as soon as she hit the ground running, and you that's the reason you bring in somebody very, very senior, because this person can truly hit the ground running, right? So we were at a point where we're trying to do the protocol, we're trying to do an ICF, we're trying to do a feasibility questionnaire, while trying to bring in a CRO. So all of these things are happening. And I was doing everything. So bringing this person on and telling this person, okay, you're going to drive the protocol, you're going to write the ICF, things like that, that also enabled, when the CRO actually came on board, you want to be creative about their contract. It's like, okay, we don't have time to go and, look at all the minutia of a big contract and a work order. Let's just sign up for an initial service agreement, and let's just work on, focus on the near-term milestones. And while we're doing that, in the back end, we can work on the work order, knowing what that scope of work is even more defined. So yeah, you got to just go for your next target. It's a moving target. So
excellent. Stephen, Viv, feel free to pitch in.
So I like what Tina said about it's a moving target, especially when during COVID, you're looking for your resources. And to Stephen's point, yes, people, when they interview, they start asking for these bigger titles, but their job description doesn't really fit that title. So that makes it very difficult. So how it changed me was I never had to really do budget, because in a bigger or medium-sized company, they have someone to do that. So to be more flexible and agile, as the last person mentioned, you learn about it. You learn as you go, and you be open-minded. You ask all the questions you can. So for me, it kind of built out my skill sets even more, to be more open-minded, how to help the team, because the end goal is help the company, help the patients, and how to move forward with the team. So you have to pick up things as you go, ask questions. And so we are building that out. In the end, we did reach out to a consultant. So that did work out. And we did end up hiring one person for outsourcing. So that was helpful. So that's my takeaway from the whole situation.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything that Tina and Vivian said. You have to be flexible and find a solution, and find the right person. And consultants, contractors are a way to go. They are pricey, but maybe that's a short-term solution. As Tina mentioned, I just need an ICF. I don't have time to write it, and you know how to do it, so just get it done. And it's easier to, I think, work with a contractor or a consultant than if you've outsourced a lot of stuff to a CRO, and you have additional work that has come up that perhaps wasn't scoped for it, and just going through a rescoping and additional service, service stuff is so onerous. It just becomes another task that one has to do. So, you never have a blanket sort of CRO resource where you simply say, oh, I forgot about this piece, and can I get this support? Well, it usually involves a change order and a discussion and an update and all this stuff. So consultants can sort of fill that gap. But, hourly rates for really experienced people, you have to really, really manage and maximize that person's time. And one of the considerations is, when you think about a consultant, that I'm always thinking about is they're doing work, they're charging per hour, and when I include them in meetings or discussions, I'm being charged for that as well. And so I always think about, is it absolutely necessary for this person to be in an hour-long meeting if I'm paying a rate for them to just be receiving information? So it's a lot more pressure, I think, on project leaders to really manage this contract very carefully when it comes to participation in meetings or discussions or whatever. It's always something that's top of mind for me.
No, you remind me of a story that a lawyer friend of mine told me, that when he gets invited for a coffee in the morning, he warns his guests that, do you really want to have that coffee? Because it's going to cost you a couple $100 before we are done. So you have to be careful about having consultants. To your point, are they just there listening? I know we are 11 minutes past 3. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience, but if there is anything, Katie, let us know. I want to ask you one more question to the panel. Obviously, you talked about all of you talked about leveraging consultants as needed. We talked about some of the other the constraints. Any particular technologies that have come in handy to you with respect to planning and budgeting? And I'm talking about more on the technology side. Obviously we've been using Zoom or Teams or some of those other things for remote working and so on. But specific to your work-related things, any technologies that that has been handy that our listeners might find useful or to consider? Not that we are here to promote any specific platforms or tools, but it's just something to share with our listeners.
I guess I can start. The
Yeah.
things, I think all of project management, all the PMs are aware, things that I found useful, honestly, was Tableau, to just kind of give you that outlook of what's going on, your status, your projects, what's going on. It's a part of communication, right? If you can't meet in person, they can click on that to say, oh, the CMO sees like, okay, we're on track with that. I don't have to worry about it. Or, why are we kind of behind on this? I know who to reach out to. So for me, that has been really useful.
Okay.
I can go next. We're using, and I've done this in 2 startups. We've used Smartsheets because I think it's easily scalable. So Smartsheets becomes our integrated sort of timeline tool that we use. And we use Box. Box is also scalable. And both companies have done that. There comes a point in your organization, early on, you're not going to invest in an enterprise system at all. Right? It's just you just don't have the dollars for that. But there does come a time where that does pivot. When you, in my case with my previous company, when you get closer to perhaps IPO, you've got to put in a lot more standards and systems in place, and oftentimes that's when the conversations around more of an enterprise system becomes a reality for your executives.
Right.
And the conversation then becomes, what are the modules that you want to include in that enterprise system that either supports resource management or project management or whatever, and then you have that conversation. But starting off, it's always PowerPoint. Starting with PowerPoint communication. I use PowerPoint as dashboards, but Smartsheets and Box are good, reliable.
Good, right.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Tina, anything to that?
Yeah, so I liked what both Vivian and Steven said. So Tableau, Smartsheets. One platform that I was introduced to, especially during the pandemic when no CRAs were allowed on site, and in terms of trying to meet at least 80% of your source data verification, right? And one CRO, large CRO, introduced us to this platform that they were using called Protocol First. And Protocol First was a platform where the site, apparently it's very intuitive and it's very easy for the sites to actually get there and upload any source documents. And of course it's redacted and all of that is uploaded, and the CRA is able to access that in order to do their source data verification. And that's how it was that the trial that we were working with this CRO was 100% remote because we were at the peak of COVID. So I thought that was fascinating and something that I keep in mind because now, even though we're not completely away from COVID, I talk about it with some of my CROs to see what platforms they have similar to that, because I think we have to move beyond the mindset of 100% source data verification, especially on site. So we've got to start to think about some ways of doing it.
Thank you all three. So before we leave, just one or two key takeaways from each of you for our audience that they might like to remember. So Stephen, we'll go with you first.
Yeah, I would just say, we've mentioned it a couple of times, you have to be flexible. I mean, no one expected COVID to have such an impact. I think the future coming out of COVID is now going to be very different with our more remote team members. I think with resource constrained environments, there's going to be more oversight on how are we managing virtually rather than managing all co-located. So it's a skill set I think people have to learn. And I think that's and finding the right people, having a really good sort of recruitment strategy, and then given that it's such an employee market right now, starting to think about a retention strategy would be really good, because you certainly don't want to lose your star players, given that you spent so much time and effort bringing them in and training them up and developing the expertise.
Great points. Viv?
Yeah, Stephen, great points. Kind of took some of mine away. My biggest one is communication is like the biggest key factor in building anything, building a team, getting to know your CRO, putting governance together. I think it's the biggest thing where you become that person where people can approach you if they have problems. They're not afraid to do so. So for me, communication is the biggest takeaway from this whole COVID and building resources and things like that. So that's my biggest takeaway from this. And I hope everyone else took that away too.
Okay. Tina, last but not the least.
So yeah, communication. Thank you, Vivian. That was my top one, because you heard Stephen saying you don't want to invite your high-paid consultant to a meeting. So one way to make sure that everyone's aligned is that communication, right? Then I think the other one, we talked, especially this huge curveball that came to us, right, with the pandemic. What do we do? And I think one of the important things to do is to proactively identify risk and mitigate them proactively as well, so that as we've discussed right now, how we've kind of circumvented some of these things, whether it's resource constraints or anything else, in order to keep those timelines moving. And along with that, I think with the resource constraint topic, we have been thinking, but probably thinking more, which is artificial intelligence. How can machines replace people? Stephen, you talked about you're working in a gene therapy environment. I worked once upon a time in one of those environments, and we had all of our manufacturing done in-house. That was something we did not want to outsource. That complete operation was done in-house. And we were starting to look, and I'm sure by now they have kind of implemented some of those in terms of robots doing some of the work that you would probably need a scientist to do. So that era is definitely on us now.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, all of you, Stephen, Viv, and Tina, for an excellent discussion on the topic of resource-constrained environment, and enlightening us with some of your experiences and takeaways. So with that, I'll wrap it up and hand it back over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Darshan. Wonderful moderating. Honestly, I feel like I have so much to learn from all the moderators that I've invited to the conference. This was such a wholesome panel discussion and talk. And I love that you took the time to go over time, because you really mentioned some great takeaways, and people were loving it, I'm pretty sure. And actually, there were no comments, so I didn't want to interrupt you. And I think you were covering it all very well So probably they had nothing to ask you because I mean, you are professionals, come on. And I loved having you here. So actually I'm going to give everyone 10 minutes of a break, and I would love to just thank you all for coming, for accepting the invitation. It's our last virtual conference. I know, as you've mentioned, it seems like everyone is sick of COVID times, basically sick of COVID times. So please come and meet us online right now, and then offline for all of our events that are coming up. It's going to be wonderful. And we're going to be back very, very soon with another panel discussion.
Yep.
So come back, tune in, and Darshan is going to be there as well. So
Again,
Darshan, quick cup of
talking
coffee
about
before you
real world
go.
evidence. So, all right, we'll see you in another few. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
so much, everyone. It
Thank
was a
you all.
pleasure. Thank you. See you
Bye-bye.
shortly.
Take
Bye
care.
now.